Back in the early days of YouTube, I had a fascination of watching random ass rig tests. Back then, I didn't have a PC that could do any of that crazy ass shit, so it was all amazing to me. Keep in mind, I was still young, so I had no clue what the fuck a GPU was, or really any of that shit. Our family computer was a crappy ass Dell.
Dude, you're getting a Dell.
The thing could barely play solitaire, or really any games for that matter. It was basically just an outlet to browse the web for stupid ass shit and use AIM. But that was more than enough for us at the time. However, there was always a lingering feeling of missing out on something incredible when you watch people play these PC exclusive games and spawn thousands of watermelons or shoot down trees and other shit. It was crazy as fuck back then, especially for someone who only had really experienced console gaming on the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. For the most part, I had been content sitting in front of an old ass TV with a PS2 controller in my hands. However, there was one game in particular that I remember having a fascination with, and one that I wasn't able to actually play. That game was Crysis. Unable to actually play the game until years later on the PlayStation 3, Crysis had a certain allure to it. However, being able to actually play it for myself wasn't exactly the same as how mystical it seemed watching videos years prior. Sure, it was still fine to play, but it wasn't as exciting as looking at the game in action back during the early YouTube days. Fast forward to 2022, and I actually have a PC that could run Crysis, but the game is no longer on the mind with so much fucking shit to play out there. And then one day a Steam sale pops up and Crysis Remastered at 55% off. Reminded of the game again, I stare at it intently before naturally deciding that I'm gonna fucking buy that shit. Before getting into the actual game, I want to briefly go over the history. Crysis was originally developed by Crytek, who had previously developed Ubisoft's Far Cry back in the year 2004. As for the original Crysis, the game released in the year 2007 for PC and on consoles years later in 2011. At the time of its initial release, many PCs struggled to run the game at its max settings. In return, these steep requirements helped spawn the meme of "but can it run Crysis?" Funny enough, there's also an achievement on Crysis 2 that referenced this and shows a smoking computer as the icon. The 2020 remastered version of Crysis also shows a bit of self-awareness towards the game's history with a graphical mode on PC specifically called "Can it run Crysis?" It's not really all that important, but it's still fun to think about the game's origins and how many PCs it must have brought to a crawl back in the day. With that out of the way, the question now is, how is the game itself?
Cloak engaged, 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 energy critical.
Well, it's about what I remembered, except better looking. Obviously, the story isn't anything unexpected anymore either. You play as a guy called Nomad, who is a part of a group of what are basically super soldiers wearing advanced suits. These dudes are sent to the fictional North Korean-occupied Lingshan Island to find and evacuate a research team. You eventually find out that there's more than meets the eye with the island when you come across some fucking aliens and shit who are able to fucking freeze everything for some reason. My thoughts playing Crysis Remastered at this point in time were far different than when I played the game back on the PS3 over a decade ago. It was actually fun to play around with, and I can honestly say that I had a good time playing it, probably because I was paying more attention to detail than I did back when I was younger. I also have to admit that playing it now, the opening part of the game was giving me vibes of the movie Predator, where in the movie you think that Arnie and his crew are going to deal with one thing, and then the Predator comes out of nowhere and fucks their day up. The uncertainty and lack of knowledge towards what was going on gave me a similar feeling when coming across your crew being ripped to fucking shreds without a clue as to who or what was doing it. It was cool to see and made me appreciate the introduction levels of the game, probably more than I would have when I was younger. I also have to say, there's still multiple things about Crysis's gameplay that are still pretty interesting. I guess the easy thing to point to, there's the nano suit, which gives you the different abilities. You have your cloak, which makes you invisible, super speed, which basically lets you run really fucking fast, and then you have the armor, which lets you soak more bullets. There's also charge jumping, the typical health regeneration, and then being able to manhandle objects, animals, and even people, and then chuck the living fuck out of them. It's all pretty funny to play around with, especially with the game's physics. The suit itself isn't completely overpowered or anything. You do have to rely on energy, which eventually recharges after waiting a short while. Additionally, you also have a lot of weapon customization. Putting silencers, scopes, and even flashlights on your guns is possible from the get-go, but you can also find more upgrades by picking up guns that have attachments attachments on them, giving you more variety. Though, as much as you have a decent amount of options, I found myself using the same few weapons and attachments over and over again. I guess this is something that depends on the player's playstyle, but for me it would have been nice to have a few more options. I do have to admit, the game's engine made some weapons funny as shit to play around with as well. Blasting an enemy with a sniper rifle and watching them fly the fuck away was pretty hilarious too. What's also pretty cool is that you're able to approach missions in a non-linear fashion for the first 2 acts of the game. You can basically go about doing any objective in multiple ways, attempting to jump up the side of a mountain or sneak by scumbag patrols by slinking by in some bushes, driving full speed into some fuckers, or even going all out and punching the fuck out of people. It doesn't really matter how you go about doing it, as long as the shit gets done. There's also secondary objectives during your missions, which tasks you with doing different shit. It could be anything from obtaining some data to disabling radars. There's a lot of shit to do on each level, so it doesn't leave you feeling fucking bored as shit focusing on one task. The variety of options available to the individual makes playing the game a lot more fun when you could go about doing shit in different ways. It all just depends on your playstyle. Well, the first 2 acts are pretty fun. In Act 3, however, things change a lot more. The game is more linear at that point, and can be a bit of a slog with difficulty spikes up the fucking asshole. I found myself struggling at several points, literally only being able to progress, either by having to run by everything, or just repeatedly creep out back and forth in corridors and houses until everything in the area was fucking dead. Crysis took me about 7 hours to complete, and a little over 8 to get 100% of the achievements. And that was playing on the hardest difficulties, so I didn't really notice anything too bad. However, I did take notice of a lot of bullshit inconsistencies, especially towards the end of the game. It was kind of fucked up because some of the enemies would do some of the stupidest shit to the point of it seeming like a joke, and then others were able to sniff through my invisible cloaks as if they had thermal optics or some shit attached to their retinas. But regardless of any minor complaints, Crysis Remastered is still a pretty good game. There's some issues here and there with graphical shit and inconsistent AI, but I don't think that's something so detrimental to ruin the game for someone. If you can buy Crysis Remastered for cheap, it's definitely worth playing, especially if you've never had the chance in your life. There's a lot of fun shit in the game, and I think that being able to experience a piece of history is always cool. Apparently, Crysis 4 is in the works too, so we'll see how that goes. Until then, there's a trilogy of these games out there waiting to be played.